Welcome back to the Quitcast, everybody. It is time to continue the series, What Drives This Character? And today we are talking about one of my absolute favorite shows of all time. Not my favorite show of all time, we'll get there, but one of my favorite shows of all time, and probably one of the most consistently praised characters that I hear in the writer sphere. And in fact, I hear a lot of romance authors in particular who have said at one point or another in their marketing materials about their books that they are basing their character off this person. And when you hear that, part of it, granted, is the actor who played this person is very, very excellent at this particular type of character. And when you see them play other characters like this, they just excel at it. And so you know there's something that resonates in particular about that. But part of it is that there are some stock things about relator and restorative as a combination that tend to fulfill certain of the overarching or common fantasies between people who read certain kinds of romance novels. And again, not every single romance novel. We don't believe that anything is a monolith around here, obviously, but there is a consistency in that sort of dark brooding hero type when you are reading male characters, that it's very common that that particular type of person is attractive to the reader for whatever reason. And they may or may not have anything to do with relator and restorative as a combo. These people may or may not be interested in that combination of traits in real life, but there's something about it on screen that just brings the imagination to life, and something about it in books that makes authors want to replicate that experience of watching Supernatural and falling in love with Dean Winchester. So, we're going to talk a little bit about Dean Winchester today, and specifically about the relator restorative combination that he has, and how we can relate to them in the real world, in addition to seeing how they act in fiction. So I'm going to say up front, because we've had a conversation about this character on my Patreon in the past, I'm going to say up front, I have particular opinions about Dean's strengths, because when I watch the show, I also can't help sort of coding behavior. It's just kind of how my brain works. So I'm watching certain things happen, and then the double piece in my brain is this a story element, or is it actually pertinent to his character long term? We talked a little bit in the first episode about this. It's one of the reasons that I find it a little easier to talk about movie characters, or about short TV show characters like Ted Lasso, where we only have a limited amount of access to their character actions. Because the longer a TV show goes on, or if you're writing fiction, the longer an ongoing series happens, the more you have to at least occasionally sacrifice character integrity in terms of the alignment of the character to real understood personality traits, and trajectories of personality development. You have to sacrifice that sometimes because, hey, we've got to make sure people keep watching the show or keep reading the book, and we can't just treat fiction like it's reality, because those two are not the same, right? And we talked a little bit in the first episode about complexity and the importance of complexity in reality being a real thing, but that often the easiest characters to understand are those that have some of the simpler, more aligned, more direct motivations. And I think in TV in particular, you can't have, if you're going to have a real long running series, you can't have just one motivation for a character. So in Dean's particular instance, I couldn't watch or rely on my having watched all of the episodes, because he shows up a little bit differently in a few places for very specific reasons. And I'm going to kind of take those out of the canon and excerpt them in terms of, in my brain, when I'm coding that behavior, it would be really different from if I was paying attention to a real person and I was saying, wait, that doesn't align with something that I understand, right? It doesn't make sense to me. So how do I make it make sense? In a real person, you would say, okay, there's an underlying motivation that I don't understand, or something that's more complicated than I could possibly understand, or they're lying to me, right? Which is possible. That does happen with people for various reasons, and not all of them are. And I don't mean bad in terms of like, it still doesn't feel great when it happens, but some of it is not, you can't help it sometimes, right? Because not everyone can afford to show all of their vulnerabilities. This is where Dean comes in. But not everyone can afford to show all of their vulnerabilities to every single human they encounter. So you may or may not deserve someone's, in terms of like what's at stake in your relationship, you may or may not deserve someone's full like authenticity, for them showing up in a way. And that might appear on the outside like these things don't line up. But the reality is that's just not part of the relationship that you have with them, right? So, what's important to know when you're looking at the difference between like I trust or don't trust a person in real life versus I trust or don't trust a character, those things have to be different, because unless we are watching them all in a row, and I've talked to several of you who've had this experience with Buffy in addition to Supernatural. So those of us who watched Supernatural or Buffy before streaming, before you could watch the entire season at one time, right? When the DVDs first came out, I still remember watching all of a season of Buffy in a row and being like, that I do not remember the characters being like this, because over the course of an entire year, you notice the difference less than you do in over the course of 2 days. It seems like that's a change that I should have noticed was a big deal, and I didn't. But when you're watching it over the course of 9 months, you don't necessarily pay that close of attention to the individual characters. So some of the growth arcs in Supernatural, we're not going to see as much in some of the shows that are made for streaming today, because the writers are so much more aware that we're going to be watching the episodes next to each other, versus I think when we were watching them with at least a week and sometimes more in between, you could get away with either repeating the same things over and over again with characters or with changing them just a little bit. And so that to me is also important in terms of considering whether or not I want to try to make a character more aligned. Is it likely that people are going to binge read my books? Is it likely that, and there's a good chance people are going to do that. So I would also be every once in a while keeping a weather eye on the horizon about series consistency for those of you who write long series. But anyway, I digress because I'm trying to draw out the experience of talking about Dean Winchester as much as I can. And here's why. So these two characteristics in particular, relator and restorative, are two of the traits that I do not have as high. So when I go looking to understand them, I usually am looking at people that I know, or I'm looking at, like we've talked about the cards before, right? The theme insight cards, because I do like to use them as a resource when I'm coaching, because I'm looking for the consistency of the personality traits, right? And one of the ways that I get to understand the traits that I don't have as strong is by seeing that alignment acted out in either in fiction, because there's some really excellent aligned versions of relators or restoratives in fiction. Hello, Beast from Beauty and the Beast. Hello, Dean Winchester. But also in my friends and the people that I care about who have these traits, where I get to see, oh, that's what that arc looks like, or that's what that development path looks like in that relator or that restorative. Restorative is 31 or 32 out of 34 for me. So it's not something that I come by easily or quickly. So characters like, so Charlie Brown, for instance, is a restorative character, and you'll see this very consistent, like, problem solving attitude. And I think some people think of strategic problem solving. When they think of problem solving, it's like, ooh, let me sort of creatively help to understand all the possible ways that we could solve this problem, versus a restorative problem solving, which is often more focused on the problem itself. It'll be, I come across a problem and then I need to keep after it until I finish, or until I fix it, or until I understand it. And so that restorative trait, that somebody like, you'll see it on its own very consistently in Charlie Brown. And with Dean Winchester, it really is in combination with other traits. But restorative, what I love about the restorative in his character is that the negative aspect or the critical aspect of restorative, when you're dealing with something like demon hunting, where like somebody needs to be on the lookout for the problems, somebody needs to be on the lookout for what doesn't seem right here, for what we need to execute on, right? For, oh, there's an issue here, let's go after it. That kind of more critical thinking skill that we see in restoratives a lot in real life doesn't always feel the same when it's aimed at you. So I think a lot of people have an experience with restorative that's very personal, and they aren't always able to see the benefit of restorative. Where I think seeing it in a situation where you're taking advantage of the trait, like when you're doing something like demon hunting in a fiction show, is really cool because you get to see like what happens if you're the person who's always on the lookout for those problems. What happens if your version of being helpful is coming in and fixing something? What happens if your version of, the sort of like love language of restorative, which is I've got this. Like I'll fix this. I'll do this. And they tend to be, at least in this type of character, where they're also somewhat introverted, and you have that relator. The core of relator, that gravity center of relator, is depth of relationship and that desire for really, really deep and often narrower relationships where you're going to have fewer friends and they're going to be deeper. So we talk a lot about the relator castle, right? Where there's people on the inside, maybe just one person on the inside. And then as you go out in the relator circles, there are fewer people in the totality of the circles, but those people that are inside those circles have deep relationships with the person who is the person who has the relator trait. And then the relator wants to get deeper with those people rather than find like new relationships to start. And so I want to make a differentiation between the way that Dean is as that sort of player mentality where he's always on the lookout for a hookup, and versus the way he is in a relationship, which when he's in a actual romantic relationship, he's very different from when he's doing that sort of hookup thing. So that relators could be like that for sure, because they're not really starting relationships with all of those people, but that's not the point. The point of that trait of his is to show that juxtaposition between somebody who's really serious and does the work and is always about the mission and always about the job. But then there's this part of him that's sort of playful and, um, you know, I mean, he's attractive as a person, so it would make sense that he would take advantage of that as a way of sort of blowing off steam around this very, very stressful job. But the piece of character development, I think, for that has more to do with showing that there is a juxtaposition there between those two traits. And I think when you have a relator that's really visible, the way that his relationships are with his dad and with his brother and with the few friends that he does have. And again, like this is one of the commonalities with relators, is that they tend to have very few deep relationships and very few friendships. But when they do have friendships, those are the people they're vulnerable with. Those are the people that they're close to. And they want to continue to be with those people rather than sort of reach a point where they're like, no, this is enough. Like, I don't really like, you know what I mean? Like, they want to go deep. But then what happens is the relator, I guess, progression of relationship is sort of like there is a trust test that you pass with relators. And once you pass the test, then they let you in a little bit deeper into the vulnerability. And then if you hit a point where it's like, okay, you've done some things. I don't know if I want you any closer to me, or just you don't want to be any closer to me, right? Because relators are very much about mutual relationships. So they're not going to force you to be in a relationship with them. They're going to let you come closer if you want to. And if they do want to be in a deeper relationship with you, they want you to come closer. But there isn't this sense of like, I'm going to draw you in, right? Like you would sort of have that with maybe like a woo would be like, I want us to be closer. Relators are very much like, if you want to be closer, great. If you don't want to be closer, great. But this is where you then belong in the circles. And this is how I'm going to relate to you. if we're going to be closer, there's more vulnerability. So when you have somebody like Dean over the course of the seasons who's becoming more and more close to his brother, who by all accounts he had not been very close with when the show started. And I think this is maybe the most interesting part of the relator growth arc for me about Supernatural is that even though there's family relationships, Dean is not very vulnerable with his brother, especially in the earlier seasons, and they really grow into those places. You can almost see those trust tests get passed when Sam doesn't like judge him or doesn't respond in a disconnective way or doesn't want too much from him either, right? Like the fact that Sam also has some level of introversion, and when they're spending time together, it's not just like very like there's a very high intimacy expectation emotionally. That's not what Sam is like. And so they have this real ease in, let's see if you want to be close to me, let's see if I want to be close to you. And then as they start to get closer and closer, and there's a particular episode too where Sam starts to come into his powers, and Dean is a little bit skeptical about that, and they have this really vulnerable experience of like Sam feeling like Dean could judge him for this, right? Like there could be a disconnect between the two of them because of this. And the way they work through this is probably the most relator arc ever, because there's always this sense of like, even when they're frustrated with each other, there's never a feeling of like, okay, now you're just gone. Because when relators are done, you're out of the circles, you're not coming back in. And so there's always this level of safety in that progression inside those relator circles between the two of them, because there is always an expectation that well, we're in this together. So we're just going to keep getting closer, and we're going to work through these conflicts, even if it means we have to separate for some time and go figure out ourselves on our own. And again, some of the ways that they respond in their relationship are the writers trying out to see how things are going to work between them, or maybe exploring the sides of the personality. But once we finally get past those kind of first two seasons where they're exploring the edges of how this relationship is going to work, you really start to see Dean's relator come out, and he gets extremely protective, and he gets very like focused on his brother. And his brother, by the end of where I have seen, which I think I told you at the first episode of this, I haven't seen the last three seasons of this show yet. Although I do know what happens at the very end, just because when the show ended, I wanted the spoilers. But the show kind of jumped the shark for me a little bit after season 10-ish. And so I haven't watched all the way to the end. But what you see as the series progresses is you see this closer and closer and closer relationship where the relator in particular is so interested in maintaining and deepening close relationships that when you have something like that with your brother, where you've been in those really difficult places and you know each other so well and you trust each other, that you have this almost like secret language between the two of you when you understand what's going on without having to communicate. And I love being able to see that. And you get some of that even in season 4 in this show. And that the progression isn't necessarily linear, because again, I think when the show goes on too long, and not too long like it shouldn't have been that long, but too long in terms of you run out of arcing on individual character bases, you have to be able to make the characters complicated in different ways, and then you introduce other characters and have villains and things like that, which changes the way that they respond. But from just a pure like individual relator perspective, the growth of Dean into someone who can be a little bit more emotionally open and emotionally intimate throughout the course of the series, because his brother's very much there. Like his brother has a little bit more vulnerability and a little more honesty and a little more openness throughout the majority of the show. There's one section in the Ruby season, and I forget which season that is, where that kind of changes in Sam a little bit. And I think that was sort of like a response to the plot, I think. But that relator development in terms of the way that the character moves for Dean is he's going to start to trust as they spend more time together. And as they start to deepen their relationship, he's going to trust more. He's going to trust that his brother will be on his side. He's going to trust that he's there, that it's okay to be vulnerable, that they're always going to come out on top, right? Like he starts to trust all of these things about this relationship over time, which in terms of relator, like what relators want the most is that depth of relationship. And so you kind of see Dean growing into that over the course of especially the first couple of seasons, I think, which is really cool to watch. And then the restorative piece is the other part that I find to be really interesting about his character, because there is often a lot of stoicism in restorative characters because they are so focused on wanting to fix things. And so restorative as a strength is that problem solving, and very specifically the ability to see problems and not be intimidated by them. And I think the consistency of Dean's character is that courage, I guess, is the right word, but it's not courage like blind courage, like just no matter what happens, we're just going to run into the burning building kind of thing, right? It has a lot more to do with the fact that he can see what should happen, or that he can see that there's something they could do or something they could try. And you'll often see the two of them when they're going through the particular mystery, the monster of the week, right? Like you'll see him almost like picking at certain things about the theory that Sam has, or the construction of who the monster is, or who the villain is in this particular episode, and you'll watch him kind of pick at these things and try and figure it out. And the two of them come at it from slightly different perspectives. I think Sam has a little more strategic in his personality, and Dean is less anticipatory, I think, in that way is the word I'm looking for. He's more concrete, which is really cool to watch the difference between those two. And I'm not sure if that was intentional on behalf of the actors, just kind of shaping the character over time and having more nuance to them, but that was really cool to watch as well. So with restorative, the other piece that's interesting about development wise with characters who have restorative, and this can actually be reflected a little bit when people have restorative, is that it's not uncommon for you to be isolated sometimes because of that particular trait. So when you won't just accept things, when you're constantly questioning whether or not something is true, when you are not willing to go with the flow, or take things at face value, or you're always looking for the problem, like that can be sort of jarring for some people to experience, and they may not respond well to that interpersonally. And you see that sometimes with Dean, the way that he'll just not accept things or pick at things or say, that can't be right, or that doesn't seem right, or let's figure this out, or let me fix this. Like there's very much that feeling of action in him, but not action in the way that you would see, like, let's say Spike from Buffy, right? Who has activator as a trait and who is very like just ready, fire, aim, action oriented about things, that there is really sort of no bigger picture thinking, no strategizing in that moment. It's just, I have to take action. And they get really impatient and they just want to move. And Dean is not like that. He doesn't have that execution on that level. And from a character driven perspective, when you are writing characters who feel nuanced and real, not everyone who feels active is active in the same way, right? You might have an activator active who's very like pushy, do, we've got to start right away. Everything has to, very impatient, right? And then you might have an impatience for results, which is a more achiever driven thing, or a more strategic driven thing, where I want to see the outcome. I want to see the work happen. And so when I'm getting impatient, it's, I want to see the manifestation of what I've been putting my work into. Whereas you might see someone like a restorative or a deliberative still be action action oriented, still want to move forward, but they're not going to move too quickly because they want to make sure to move correctly. And so that's a really different feeling from that kind of impatience that's driven. And so you may set up two characters as opposites that have those different feelings to them, that sort of we have to move quick. There's this activator energy, and then the restorative or the deliberative or the intellection potentially, right? Where it's like, well, but have we thought about this? Like, let's make sure we're doing everything right before we move on. That kind of cautious feeling, right? And there is this piece that's really interesting about the combination of caution and also courage, because it's not, it doesn't directly attribute to only one strength, right? It's almost like there are layers of that motivation. So you might have the drive for restorative being, I've got to fix this problem, but it's, I want to fix it correctly. So I might be less driven to just throw a hammer in my hand and start nailing things versus I may be willing to stop and look at it from multiple angles, maybe do some research, maybe figure some things out first before I jump all the way in. But then I might have a character with me who is more impatient, who's going to provide that counterpoint and that friction point. With, again, we've talked a couple of times in this series about the duos who have like the sort of flip sides of the same energy, and that I want to get things done energy can just have those different manifestations. They don't always have to look the same. And I think this is one of my favorite things about writing fiction and consuming fiction is that sort of nuance of the way that character differences can present, and they can provide so much friction and so much conflict. And then of course you learn different things. And this is maybe the like part that we haven't gotten into a ton about Dean, because I haven't seen the end of the series. So I don't really know what it is that Dean learns at the end of the series, because a lot of what happens in the individual episodes are not character growth arc learning points. They might be learning points for individual, like we're fighting this villain, so we're learning things about the villain, or we are learning things about our dad in the very beginning, or our mom, or about, whoever the bigger picture is about in that moment. We may be learning things that have to do with a particular person, but we're not always seeing a lot of individual character growth in that long of a series. Versus if you were to write a Dean Winchester character in a novel, you might pick one trait of his in this restorative, that need to fix things, that need to see things be um, perfected or be transformed or be restored. Like you might pick just that one trait of his and then give him a problem that stands in his way. And then what he learns at the end, because this is how that restorative arc works, right? What he learns at the end is either I knew the answer all along, I needed to believe in myself, or it is, I always need to ask for help, or it is, because if he's too internal and shutting everyone down too much, then what he needs to learn at the end is I need to open up, I need to trust my found family, I need to trust this person that I'm falling in love with, I need to trust whoever it is that he needs to trust in the course of that fiction story, right? Then what you're going to learn will depend on what particular piece of restorative you're struggling with or relator that you're struggling with. And what I love about watching the growth arcs in fiction is that most of the time we're going to see the resolution of the real character trait will happen in the fiction story, because when someone wants something and something stands in their way, then this is how they get it, right? Is they become the person that can overcome that obstacle. They become the person who can fix any problem. They become the person who can stop seeing themselves as hopelessly flawed. They become the person who can accept that they're lovable. They can become the person who can accept that amazing people want to be with them, right? Like that, whatever that restorative pain point is, where they're in a fiction story where they need to learn something on the inside. The thing that they're lacking is the thing that the story needs to provide them. And again, this for me is sometimes authors can do this intentionally. Sometimes we can do it from the beginning. Sometimes we can't. So sometimes what we need is a good editor to help us figure this stuff out and see the holes in ourselves. And also, I do think that many of us write this way intuitively without realizing it because we have a trait, one or the other of the 4 or 5 traits that this can come from, that helps us to understand people's emotions kind of from the inside and helps us to be able to look at what is driving a character and getting them to the place where they need that fulcrum point and then they learn the thing and then they get the thing and then they're different, right? That kind of growth arc for a character. So, if we're looking at what drives Dean Winchester and the word family doesn't come out of our mouths, that's probably a wrong answer. Because that's definitely the main driver point of basically every single thing that happens with him. But where that comes from, I think, is partly, and I'm going to get a little philosophical here, is partly in trying to fix the fact that his family is not whole and hasn't been whole since he was very young. And I think there's a restorative part of him that is trying to put all of this back together. And you see this in the scenes in the very beginning, I guess the first season and a bit, with his dad, where the way that he's trying to kind of put his family back together and use this as an excuse to kind of reforge this relationship with his brother and bring his family back into alignment. I think you see some of that restorative there and some of the relator drive, right? Where when his dad is not around anymore, he's lost the person who's on the inside of his relator circle. And he talks about this a lot in the first season, where he and his dad have had this very close relationship over the course of the last several years. And when his dad doesn't come back from a hunting trip, he's lost his inner circle person and he needs a new inner circle person. So his brother becomes that person. Spoiler alert. I don't think that that's probably spoiling anything. But anyway, obviously, I'm a massive fan of Supernatural and I love the character of Dean Winchester in particular for these 2 traits. I struggle a little bit with these long running TV shows because the characters aren't as consistent. So when I was going through and watching some of the episodes and being like, okay, I'm looking for, these traits and looking for these examples. And it was like, oh, that doesn't seem, but then it's like, oh, but the plot needed him to do this particular thing, right? So there is a part where it is fiction, Becca, and we have to remember that it's fiction. And so, what I'm going to try to do, I think we're going to do a couple of movies in the next couple of episodes. And I want to try to narrow down on some arc things, especially growth arcs for any of you who are watching this for craft purposes. And hopefully, if you're watching this for personal development purposes or listening for personal development purposes, you also have heard some things about your own personal development that will be helpful. Please don't forget to ask questions if you do have them. I'm always happy to answer if I am able to. And if the questions get too overwhelming, I will probably have to take a pause because I'm trying in my own personal development. One of the things I'm trying to do is make sure to have time off and take time to myself. The sort of helper Enneagram style in me struggles with that a little bit, but we're getting there. So please feel free to ask questions if you have them. If you are looking for information about what is happening in anywhere in the Better Faster Academy or Becca verse, I guess, we have a newsletter. I will put the link in the show notes so that you can follow along. I'm trying to put out content schedules every month for us so that we'll have some things to follow along on so you'll know what's coming up. You can always check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Becca. There's usually a post that tells you what's going on at the very top of the Patreon. And so hopefully that will also provide some help if you need it. But please feel free to ask questions if you want to. And if I can't answer them, I will try to get one of the assistants to come on and help with that as well, just so we can keep up with logistics. But Thank you so much to everyone who has been watching these episodes. It has been quite an experience for me to try to get back into the content production machine. We have taken a break from that for the last couple of years, just really only doing content when we could fit it in. And I don't think I realized how much I missed delivering the Quitcast. And I was actually going back through and watching some of the old episodes just to kind of see, like, what did we used to do even on the Quitcast? Sometimes I forget. Futuristic just loses touch with the past sometimes, but and I was going back through and watching, and it's funny because you can actually see the evolution of my journey over the course of, like, the length of my hair and where I am located in the world where I'm delivering the information from, and which house I was in at that point and where I was living and all that stuff. So, where I was traveling to. And it's just been really interesting to go back through and watch that. And this is the seventh season. We're starting the seventh season of the Quick Cat in January of 2025. And that is a little bit scary for me just because I don't know, it's a little scary. So, we'll see what happens. I have some other things planned for the early part of the year. I think we want to get through some of these What Drives This Character episodes because they were a lot of fun for me to record. We have some episodes coming up that are coaching sessions that I have recorded, like full coaching sessions with people so that you can listen to that and experience what that feels like. And I'm going to pop into the coaching sessions every once in a while and be talking about what you're learning and how to apply some of the things. So we're still going to do plenty of personal development, but I wanted to just do at least a little bit of craft work here at the very beginning of the year because I'm also getting back into writing more fiction this year, which I'm really excited about. So I hope that you will join me in going to open the manuscript right now because that's where I am headed at this exact moment. So I hope everyone has a great day and happy writing, and we will see you on the next Quick Cast. Bye, everybody.